Ahoy! Joe Buddy Hambone here, and I'm back again with a brand new coupon code from our friends over at Noble Knight Games. This month, the coupon code is HORROR, and it's good for 10% off any order of $10 or more, and it's going to run from October the 12th through November the 11th. That's right, our friends at Noble Knight hooked up a killer code for Halloween, and it's called HORROR. So put that in to get your discount code of 10% off any order of $10 or more, either online or if you're lucky enough to walk through those beautiful doors in person. Now, you're probably thinking to yourself, but Hambone, I have so many games on my shelf that I don't know if I have any room for more games. Well, let me tell you something cool about our friends over at Noble Knight Games. They have a killer buy, sell, and trade program going on. And if you want to know more about that, check out nobleknight.com/buy, sell, trade. This is a great way for you to unload some of those games that maybe you don't love as much as you should, but somebody else would love it even more. Or if you've got a collection you're dying to get rid of to make more space, check out nobleknight.com/buy-sell-trade for more information on that. Otherwise, it's time to get a discount, and a killer discount at that. So 10% off any order of $10 or more, running from October the 12th through November the 11th, from our friends over at Noble Knight Games. Happy Halloween from the Vintage RPG Podcast.
This is the Vintage RPG Podcast, your source for the best in classic and contemporary RPGs. With your hosts, Hambone and Stu.
Welcome to the Vintage RPG Podcast, coming at you again from the clubhouse, hidden somewhere in the swamps of New Jersey. I'm John Hambone McGuire, and today I am excited because friend of the show, Mark Sable, is here to talk about his brand new comic, Miskatonic, out this Wednesday, November the 11th, from Aftershock Comics. Now, this interview is going to be a little bit on the shorter side. We did have some audio issues because, hey, we're recording this during the middle of a pandemic over the internet. Nonetheless, this interview's killer. Mark is one of the most genuine and nice dudes I've ever met in comics, and the story he's got to tell is super cool, and it's one I think you should all definitely check out. So, without further ado, to talk about Miskatonic from Aftershock Comics, our pal, Mark Sable. Hey, Mark, how's it going?
It's going well. Thanks for having me, guys.
Dude, I am stoked to have you on the show finally. We've been talking about this every time I'd run into you at New York Comic Con, and now, years later, you're finally here. And I'm stoked to have you here tonight to talk about your brand new book, Miskatonic, for Aftershock Comics.
Thank you. Yeah, it's something I hope that you and your listeners will like. I know you guys are big Call of Cthulhu fans, and in fact, I had the pleasure of playing in a Call of Cthulhu game with both of you that you ran. So yeah, basically the very short version of it is H.P. Lovecraft meets James Ellroy, or like Lovecraft Country meets Boardwalk Empire. So it's a crime horror story set in the Miskatonic Valley, which was known as Lovecraft Country before the show. In fact, I think Call of Cthulhu was how I learned it was called Lovecraft Country from that supplement. And so it's set in the 1920s during what was the first Red Scare in this country, when following 10 years earlier, J. Edgar Hoover was involved in what was called the Palma Raids. There were a few anarchist bombings, and the government basically used that as an excuse to round up anybody they considered subversive, a lot of immigrants. I believe it was tens of thousands of people that were rounded up. Many were deported. And so 10 years later, there's a series of what appear to be similar bombings in the Miskatonic Valley. And Miranda Keller is one of the first, but also probably last female FBI agents who was sent to investigate this. In real life, again, when J. Edgar Hoover took over what was then called the Bureau of Investigation, there were 3, I believe, women FBI agents. By 1930, I think they were all gone. There was not another woman in the FBI until Hoover's death in the 70s. While she is not a real one, she has some basis based on some of the last ones. In fact, one of the last agents unfortunately wound up in what was then called an insane asylum, which was one of the things that made me think, oh, this is a perfect Lovecraft character, because since that's one of the better ways maybe you can end a campaign. And then she teams up with Tom Malone, who is a character from the horror of Red Hook. And they sort of have like this reverse X-Files dynamic where, so he's a retired NYPD detective. He's the believer, but he's traumatized by what he's seen. She's the skeptic. And then they go and kind of investigate, and, they wind up encountering Lovecraftian horror. And I specifically get to touch on and sort of reinvent a bunch of classic Lovecraft stories. So I think without spoiling anything, I can say it's like The Shadow of Innsmouth is where we start, but we also touch on Dreams in the Witch House and Thing on the Doorstep. That's a big one because we get to use Asenath Waite, who's one of the few female characters that Lovecraft wrote. And so she's kind of a femme fatale in this. I kind of got to play around with it and more. I won't spoil some of the others because it's a fun surprise if you're a Lovecraft fan to kind of hopefully they're Easter eggs. So yeah, that's the book, and I'm super, super excited and proud of it.
So had you played Call of Cthulhu before we ran that session back in the start of the quarantine?
I was one of those RPG kids that started in the 80s. I did not get to play very much. Growing up on Long Island, didn't really know many people my age that were playing it other than my cousins who I would love when I got a chance to play with. My older cousins, they're like brothers to me. I'm still close to them today. But I would buy everything. And, I know when people make fun of people who are like, oh, they buy role-playing games and don't play them, it wasn't a question of like me not wanting to play them. I couldn't find people to play with, and I was shy to approach a lot of people. I would play solo adventures. So I love when you've done the Tunnel and Trolls adventures. Cause it's funny because I didn't even know about that then, but I would play like the D&D basic. I remember like they had a bunch of good, like Ghost of Lion Castle was the first one that I played. Yeah. So I had Call of Cthulhu for a long time without having actually read any of Lovecraft's stories. And then later came the stories. And then finally, in quarantine is when I got to play it, when I was like sort of well underway in this. And I was like, oh, wow, like, especially this new edition. And it was like, wow, this is actually a really easy game to play. Like, I don't know why I'd been scared off of it for so long. And so I now, by the way, play a ton of role-playing games, even before the pandemic. So like for the past 6 years, I've been running either a D&D campaign of various editions or, D&D adjacent or a Star Wars campaign. I would love to get my players to play Call now. Maybe I'll sucker them in.
Just tell them that, at the end of the session, everybody dies and you don't have to play it again,
That actually might work as a good pitch.
It's like a one-night stand. Like there's no commitment required with Call of Cthulhu. If you love it, we can always figure out a way to play ahead. But, if you hate it, everybody dies at the end. It's great.
Between the Instagram account and this podcast, you guys have sold me so hard on Masks of Nyarlathotep. So anyway, I've been dying to play or run that. But yeah, I think I'll probably start out with one of the intro campaigns.
The thing that's interesting, though, is that you sent over a bunch of comics to check out. And I was sort of just thinking about how, like, yeah, they're comic series, obviously, you made them. But there was not too much separating the experience of reading those as like, oh, these are synopsis for comics, as it would be like, oh, these are synopsis for independent zine games, or these are synopsis for like specific scenarios for systems. And that's just sort of like one of the things I've always liked about role-playing games is that you can pull anything into a role-playing game and make a role-playing game out of it, because it's really just about telling stories with your friends.
It's funny, I was just listening to your latest podcast with the great Jim Zub. As awesome as people hear him on the podcast, he's great in real life. So I think like him, I was influenced by it, maybe not in the same way because I didn't start playing earlier. But I think my love of so many different genres was like, I would have Marvel superheroes. I mean, that was one of my introductions to comics, was like TSR's Fazarip like game. And it had the DC's Mayfair game. So like I learned about early Marvel comics. It was harder to get back issues then from the write-ups in the like Avengers Assemble. So that helped me get into comics. But it was also, I think, just like, that's where I got exposed to a lot of genres. Like I would never have probably learned about Lovecraft until much later in life if I didn't see Call of Cthulhu and, advertised in Dragon magazine, or hear people talking about it at like, role-playing science fiction conventions. And then also I think the love of mixing genres comes from it. So like a lot of my books tend to mix one or two things. So Miskatonic is a crime book and it's a horror book. So Graveyard of Empires, which is one of the more successful books I did for Image with Paul Azaceta, is a war horror comic. I was an 80s, 90s kid. So like that was a period when you'd see stuff like Shadowrun that would, mix up fantasy and cyberpunk. Or even, I remember there was a Cthulhu punk game that I never owned and still haven't checked out. I think it would be interesting, but just and then there's like Torg and Rifts, and then you're starting to get into like, I think you guys described it well as the like, who would win in a fight. Although in the 90s, I had it like a unabashed love for Rifts, just the art, like I guess not actually having to play it, just like I would just make characters on my own and just be like, oh, well, like just the world seems so awesome. And yeah, well, it has mechs and ninjas and vampires. And then in my writing, it's something I have to pull back on, right? Like I think you mix two genres, it's good. You start to get a third one in there or a fourth, and then it's just like people stop caring about the characters.
But like that was the 90s, right? That was the perfect moment in time for those sort of overblown genre mixing things, because like it's almost as if like culturally we felt the internet coming and how everything was just going to become more available. It's weird how like Riffs and Torg and all those things sort of like anticipate the availability of everything 10 years later.
Yeah. When I think of Riffs and I think of some of the artwork in it, like sort of reminded me of like proto image art. I don't know that they were influenced at it at all, but like I feel like you can see in like Jim Lee and like Liefeld stuff, like it felt like a natural progression. I think it's also just amazing how the world has changed from, there was like one dedicated role-playing game store that I knew of. Most of the role-playing games I pick up either at my local comic book store, and comic book stores were like relatively rare then, even in the like tri-state area. It was one of the things I think that made me so shy about approaching other people, because it just wasn't cool. And it's so great to see how both comics and role-playing games have become, it's not even cool, but just like, yes, selfishly, it's like, oh, it's so much easier for me to find players now. The internet helps with that. But like, also just going to comic conventions, and even me, I started as a professional going in 2005. And like in the 15 years since, conventions have not just become bigger, but more diverse. Like, when I first started going there, the only women you'd see were a few women creators who, I mean, God bless them, like what they probably had to go through. There would be like, spouses of creators, and then there'd be booth babes. And now it's like at least half are women. You see much more minorities, LGBTQ representation. And I think progress never happens fast enough. I think we've got a ways to go in both industries, but it's been a nice thing to see, in addition to just like the mainstreaming of it.
So, Mark, this book is coming out on the 11th of November. It'll be in comic book stores everywhere and available online?
Yes, and available online through Comixology. But yeah, your comic book store, if they don't have it in, just ask them. They should be able to order it. And I should just mention real quick, the art is by Giorgio Pontrelli, who's this amazing Italian artist, and Pippa Boland is a colorist from England. It's a really international thing. Our letter is from Germany, Thomas Maurer. And we've got great covers. Jeremy Hahn and Nick Filardi do the main covers, and then we've got Tony Harris and Tyler Crook doing variants, and this great new artist that Marvel has just announced as one of their young guns, Peach Momoko, is doing this store exclusive variant for El Rey Comics. So if you're into that kind of thing, then yeah, check those out too. But any of the covers are just amazing. I'm just, it's ridiculous how lucky I got with that.
I'm glad you mentioned that the artist is from Italy, because I felt that the interiors were very kind of a European style. And like, I always feel bad when I have a feeling like that, because I never know why I feel that, but you've vindicated me and I was right.
Yes. Yeah. He's great. He's known for doing Dylan Dog over there.
It does have that Dylan Dog feel. Like, okay.
He's great. And Pippa does a lot of work on colors, and it just works really well with him. It's interesting. I mean, for another podcast or something, is like, there's an interesting history of like international Lovecraft comics from Italy and Spain and South America. Like there's all these Lovecraft comics that I discovered, like doing research for this book, like to make sure I don't want to do things that have been done before, and I try to avoid typical interpretations. But like I found this whole world of like a lot of them that have just not even been translated into English, unfortunately.
Bringing it back to role-playing games very briefly, I wanted to sort of bring up the fact that both the issue that I read of Miskatonic and Lovecraft Country, the TV show, I think they're both really interesting because they feel like Call of Cthulhu adventures. And you have not really played Call of Cthulhu. And I actually had a Twitter conversation with Matt Ruff recently, and he never played Call of Cthulhu. And I think it's just really interesting that that structure or that feel, that vibe of the role-playing game can kind of carry through in a Lovecraft sort of inspired story without ever having played the role-playing game. I just think there's something really cool about that. I don't know if it's cool about the way Lovecraft stories are adapted, or if it's a testament to the power of Call of Cthulhu as a game, how well that was done. I don't know what it is, but I think it's cool.
I love the novel of Lovecraft Country. I think you actually turned me on to Victor LaValle's story, The Ballad of Black Tom. That was part of the inspiration for using Tom Malone from The Horror of Red Hook. Although I think my Tom Malone and his Tom Malone and Lovecraft's Tom Malone, I consider to be three different people, like, for sure, maybe drawing from the same well. But yeah, it is an interesting thing. And I think it's a testament to both, that I think part of the appeal of both the game, even when I was reading it and not playing it, and Lovecraft's work, was that in a sense, it was one of the first shared universes, right?
Yeah.
Like, even if it wasn't intended that way. And, and I think other later writers came and made it that way. And I think for years before I came up with this concept, I was trying to figure out a way, knowing that Lovecraft story was in the public domain, I was trying to figure out a way of like, how do I connect all these stories? And, just connecting them and telling them straight never seemed interesting enough to me. But then it was like, okay, once I started researching the history of the time and making it a period piece and figuring out, okay, let me have a woman character, and also seeing some of the like unfortunate parallels between Lovecraft and J. Edgar Hoover, like, and some of their beliefs. I was like, oh, okay, like I can tie that together, and then I can do something that hopefully hasn't been done with Lovecraft stuff before.
And that's awesome. It is awesome to be able to take something that is beloved by so many, however, has some very negative connotations to it and some stuff that is very much not so cool, and finding a way to turn it around, reinvent it, and make it for everybody. And I think that's the real power in storytelling, is being able to take that back and make it something that everyone can enjoy together.
Yeah, that's what I hope I did. And I should mention my editor, Christina Harrington, was a great big part of that on this book. Not just because she's a woman, she's just a phenomenal editor, one of the best I've ever worked with, but of just like, she was a good voice in my head to have, that just like being a straight white man, there's just sometimes like, I wanted to make sure I wasn't falling into those traps. And so having women as part of the creative team, every good colorist is a woman too, and international people, just is good in helping to make sure that like we're taking the good parts of Lovecraft and, making sure that we're either avoiding or like making commentary on the stuff that's maybe not so good. I was going to say like 80 years later, but honestly, that stuff wasn't good, in the 20s and 30s either.
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
But I think, look, if Victor Laval, who's African-American, and the showrunner, Misha Green, of like Lovecraft Country, like if they can find good stuff in Lovecraft and find like that it still has value, then like that gives me hope that, yeah, we can still enjoy this stuff, and, just have to take a little bit different of a look at it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that a lot of people are taking the salad bar approach to Lovecraft, where we're taking the croutons, we're taking the delicious bacon bits, but we're leaving behind the alfalfa sprouts.
Yeah, it's a good. You just gave me Sizzler flashbacks.
You're welcome. It's a very East Coast. What is this delicious salad bar? It has all this stuff, and then it has Brussels sprouts and like weird legumes. So, Mark, thank you.
Alfalfa sprouts are legumes. I just learned that myself.
You were this many days old when you learned about sprouts. Mark, thanks so much for joining us tonight. We are stoked to have had you on the show. We're even more excited for Miskatonic, which will be in stores on November 11th. And you could also get it online if you are reading comics digitally. It's coming out for Aftershock Comics. Mark, where can people find the rest of your books?
The best place to go is always your local comic shop. They need all the support they can get. I think, if as long as it's safe during the pandemic. If not, you can find my work on Amazon. You can find it on comiXology.com. Just put in Mark Sable. And you can always hit me up on Twitter at Mark Sable, MarkSable, whether it's to find my work, or if you read Miskatonic and you've got thoughts, I'd love to hear how Call of Cthulhu fans think of it. So please hit me up and let me know.
Thanks so much to Mark Sable for coming on the show today to talk with us about Miskatonic. Dear listener, you can pick up Miskatonic in comic stores and online in places like comiXology on November the 11th. And I'm going to tell you, this is one you're definitely going to want to check out. So thanks for listening to this week's episode of the Vintage RPG Podcast. For Stu Horvath, I'm John Hambone McGuire. May the dice always roll in your favor.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Every review helps other listeners to find us. The Vintage RPG Podcast is a ham-fisted production. Music by Dego West. Art by Schaefer Brown. If you like the podcast, you should also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com.